welcome back to the Between Two Worlds podcast, brought to you by Asian Family Services. I am one of your hosts, Romy.
Kia ora, I'm Lovely, and today we've got possibly one of the coolest people in Aotearoa, Chris Teese, who is our current Poet Laureate. He has written some really awesome stuff. You'll see his poetry in bookstores, which I just think is pretty cool, and is just an all-around awesome person. So thank you so much for saying yes to hanging out with us today. So we will just start off by getting you to introduce yourself to our the people who are listening. So over to you, Chris.
Oh, kia ora, Romy and Lovely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be on the podcast. So my name is Chris Teese. I'm a third generation Chinese New Zealander. My family on my mum's side comes from the Guangdong region in South China, and my dad's side of the family is from Hong Kong. I grew up in Lower Hutt, just outside of Wellington, and I studied film and English lit at Victoria University, Wellington, and also did my master's in creative writing there at the IIML, or the International Institute of Modern Letters.
Wait, what? The International Institute of Modern Letters?
That's what it's called.
Interesting.
It's one of those sort of names that sort of means a lot and nothing at the same time. But yeah, I did my master's there, which was a really big deal for me because it's such a hard course to get into. And yeah, since then, I have published 3 and a third collections of poetry. I say the third because my first one was like a shared collection with 2 other poets. Then 3 sort of solo collections.
Amazing.
And I became Poet Laureate in August 2022, and I'll be wrapping up my term in August 2025, so just in a few months.
All right, I have to ask, Chris, as someone who's very, very far from the arts, please tell me a little bit more about what a Poet Laureate is and what you do in that role.
Yeah, so a Poet Laureate is a poet who is given this title and given this role, and I sort of tell people that there are sort of 2 strands to it. So one of it is to write poetry, obviously, and the other is to promote and advocate for poetry. Each Poet Laureate can kind of decide how they fulfill the role and what they want to put their focus on. For me, it has been mostly the promotion and advocacy because I had just put out a book a few months before becoming Poet Laureate. So I was already in a place where I thought, I don't need to write another one for a while. But because you're Poet Laureate, you often get asked to write poems for events. To acknowledge certain things that might be happening in your country.
Okay.
So, for example, the UK Poet Laureate is often putting out poems because he has to write poems about current events and what's happening in the royal family, which is sort of the
Wow,
tradition.
that's crazy.
Yeah.
I kind of love that, though.
Luckily, I don't have that expectation on me, so I don't have to write about particular things, and no one can force me to write a poem. But yeah, it's been really lovely getting to travel the country, travel the world, and talk to people about poetry, which has actually really helped me to understand my own feelings about it as well, because I know that poetry isn't everyone's favorite or everyone's cup of tea. A lot of people have a lot of, past traumas with it because of how they were taught it at school.
Yeah.
So my job is to sort of unpick that and sort of help them to see that actually there's a lot of different poetry out there, whether it's on the page or whether it's spoken, and just to sort of expand horizons a little bit more.
That reminds me of being in high school and that unfamiliar
Absolutely,
text. And I remember
yes.
it was like year 11, and we read this poem about pot plants. And then the first question was like, how does this represent friendship? And I was like, bro, I'm so effed.
So Chris, is this sort of like something that you fell in more as you got older, or were you that kid in high school who liked doing the unfamiliar text stuff?
So I was a very creative kid. I loved the arts. My mum has always told me that, when she got my school report, the sections that were always the most positive and the most glowing were the ones to do with music or performance. So I threw myself into all sorts of creative outlets. So I loved singing. So I was in the school choir. I started learning violin, and so I joined the school orchestra. And I
Nice.
also was really into photography and filmmaking. So, like in high school, especially, my friends and I would make little short films on the weekends.
Just casually, eh?
Yeah, just pop the camera, make a little film. And I actually started writing poetry because my friends were doing it, and they were bringing poems that they had written to share at lunchtime.
Man,
And
what is
because
going on in Lower Hutt? Like, this is crazy. Poetry is cool among teenagers. I've never heard of this before.
Well, I don't think it was cool back then, in like the late 90s, early noughties. But because I wanted to hang out with my friends at lunchtime, I thought, well, I'm going to have to start writing poems just so I can sort of
Wait, you
get
guys
in
were
amongst.
writing
You're
poems?
peer pressuring yourself into
You guys are writing poems at lunchtime.
Well, they were writing them at home and then bringing them to school and sharing them at
That's really
lunchtime.
intense.
This sounds wonderful. What school did you go to, Chris?
This was really high school in Lower Hutt.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
good.
So yeah, right. I was sort of peer pressured, or had a bit of FOMO to sort of just be a part of it. But then I really, really loved it. Like I kind of found it a really different way to express myself. It was also a way where I could sort of just do it on my own. Like I didn't have to rely on being part of a choir or being part of a band or getting friends together to make a short film happen. So I then discovered that you could actually study poetry at university, and that you could take classes where they were essentially writing workshops. And so you were just set exercises, you write your poems, you bring them, and then you talk about them. So it kind of became this goal for me to get into those workshops at university, and I did. And then that sort of then led me to the master's program. And so that is essentially how I got into poetry and how it sort of became the major creative outlet for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. And I mean, this podcast, big theme of this podcast is around Asian experiences and kind of how well-being intersects with that as well. So for you, two things that I immediately see. One, as an Asian person growing up in the hut in the 90s, what was that like? And two, does being an Asian person and having that cultural background impact you as a poet or you as a creative, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So growing up in the hut, there were actually a lot of Asian families. So I never really felt like like my family and I were that different. We had a lot of Asian kids in my year group at school and also in the school generally. Also, my parents had a Chinese takeaway outlet in the mall and owned a Chinese grocery store. So we always had a lot of interaction with the local Chinese and Asian community. So it felt like we were part of something. So I never really felt like an outsider in terms of growing up as a Chinese New Zealander. And on the flip side, as a creative, I was just talking about this the other day, that I realized when I was writing as a teenager, I never really wrote about my Chinese identity. I wrote a lot about feeling like an outsider and wanting to feel like I belonged to something. And I think that more stemmed from the fact that I was queer and trying to understand and grapple with that part of myself. But when I started writing poetry at university, I kind of made an active decision to not write about the Chinese aspect of my identity because I didn't want to be pigeonholed.
Was it kind of a conscious decision, or did sort of that internal racism play into that as well?
I think, yeah, when you sort of talk about internal racism, I think that may have been a part of it. I was actually also just talking to a university class this week about how going to university and, studying English lit and poetry and being assigned the text that we were going to read and study and talk about, I didn't see a Chinese New Zealand or Asian New Zealand perspective in any of that text. So I knew on the one hand that a lot of our stories and a lot of our voices were excluded or invisible in our national literature, in our literary history. But at the same time, I really felt anxious and nervous about being only perceived as a Chinese writer or an Asian New Zealand writer. So I didn't want to sort of box myself into particular expectations, and also didn't want that, I guess, responsibility of writing about my culture and being seen as like the voice or, speak to everyone. I think as a writer of diaspora, that is something that many of us grapple with, like being seen as the representation of an entire culture or people.
I relate to that big time, eh? For the first few years of my career, I worked in mainstream mental health and was really fortunate during that time to be in a lot of leadership roles. But at the beginning of that journey, I tried really hard to not attribute my voice to the Asian community or the Asian side of me. Because same thing, it's the balance for me was around the pressure of being the voice, and then also the sort of guilt and shame around my lack of connection with my culture as well. But I can imagine, are you the first Asian poet laureate?
Yeah, so I am the first New Zealand Poet Laureate of Asian descent, the first openly queer, and currently the youngest person to ever be appointed into the role. So three sort of heavy labels, I guess, attached to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I relate to the having to be the Asian voice as someone who kind of unintentionally ended up in Asian youth research and often will be the only one talking about it, but then people not realizing that different Asian cultures are actually kind of different. And
Mm.
just because I'm Asian, it doesn't mean I can speak to like the Chinese experience because I'm not Chinese. And in terms of, I guess, that decision, because I've read a bit of your work in like supermodern minority. So what did anything kind of change for you in the way that you chose to then write about being Asian or being Chinese?
Yeah, so when I started my master's, sort of the first few weeks is that getting to know your class and getting to know your peers because you're going to be spending a year reading each other's work and giving critiques. So they sort of set you these exercises to begin with. And I remember one of the exercises was essentially like, write a poem or a piece of text that features two lies and a truth. And then, you've got to work it in a creative way. And I sort of mentioned my great grandfather in the piece that I wrote. I'm not entirely sure why, but that was the thing that I guess my class picked up on and, started asking me a lot of questions about it. And at first I thought, oh, no, I don't want to get pulled down this particular path. But then I sort of realized there might be something there because I hadn't really written about my family in that way before. So I thought, let's just see where this goes. And then that's how I sort of ended up writing a lot about how my great grandfather came to New Zealand. During that year was also the 100th anniversary of the murder of Joe Kum Yong, which is sort of the basis of my first book, How to Be Dead in Year of Snakes. So there was a lot of publicity about that. And I thought, this is a really interesting story. I'm going to write about this. And that then kind of, pushed me into writing more about those particular aspects of Chinese New Zealand history and when my own experience sort of started to filter through into it. I do look back at some of that early work and realize I was still avoiding writing about myself and sort of writing more about other people. And it took a while for me to sort of then feel like I was ready to put my own experiences into the poems more and onto the page more. I think that was just a gradual sort of like comfort thing for me as a writer because poets especially often are seen as like autobiographical writers. So everyone assumes when they read a poem that it's about you or it's about something that's happened to you. But
Yep.
Yeah.
I wanted to put some of that distance just so that people don't always assume that it is me. And also, I guess, because when I started writing poems about coming out and being queer, I also wanted to sort of just distance myself as a
Yeah,
way of
yeah.
protection.
I mean, I had a little giggle. Lovely and I were having a chat before this, and she mentioned on your guys' pre podcast call that you said something along the lines of how your parents took you being queer versus you being a writer. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I was probably sort of, making more of a joke, but I think the process of coming out to my parents and the process of telling them I wanted to be a writer was almost similar because it's almost like, how is this going to be reflected on the family? And, what does this say about us as a unit? But, thankfully, we've worked through both in different ways. I don't want to sort of conflate the two experiences because they are very, very different. My partner, he tells a story about how because his family are farmers, his dad was more angry about him being a vegetarian than he was about being gay. So people respond to things in different ways based on, I guess, their value systems and things like that. And I knew that being someone who wanted to pursue a career in the arts was going to be difficult for my parents to understand because they had worked so hard to ensure that my brother and I would have opportunities that we could go off and study the things that we wanted to study. And they almost convinced me to do a commerce degree alongside my arts degree. But at the last minute, I knew that I didn't want to do that commerce degree. It was going to be like 3 to 4 years of just me suffering through something I absolutely did not want to do. Wasn't even sure if I would even use after graduating from university. And yeah, there was that sort of question mark about like, well, what am I going to do with an arts degree? But things work out, and I ended up working in publishing, which sort of set me up for the other sort of strand of my professional life, which has been in publishing and communication.
Yeah, it's funny, eh? Yeah, we've had Lovely and I've had lots of chats about this offline as well of kind of the differing value systems that we have per generation and what that means
Mm.
for our, I guess it's like our decision making process, right?
Yeah, yeah. My mum left high school. She didn't finish high school because that wasn't expected of her particular generation and went straight into working. So she, yeah, had a very different, I guess, upbringing and and there were different sets of expectations on her. She is very, very supportive of what I've chosen to do now. And I think, in the early days, there was like this, oh, it's still just a hobby. It's just something you do on the side. This is what going to sort of, help you pay the rent and all that sort of stuff. But she sees now that, the success that I've attained and I guess the position and the responsibility that has sort of been put on me in my role as Poet Laureate is a big deal. And
Mm.
she sort of sees now why I've worked so hard to get to where I am today with that side of things.
That's cool. That's really nice. Yes, and it's interesting. I often think about how relationship dynamics change over time and kind of what different perspectives have. And I guess speaking of sort of different perspectives and things changing over time, where do you feel like you are at with your kind of well-being journey now? Is it the same for you in terms of wanting to have that distance between yourself and your writing, for example, in terms of how you're seen and how you're expressing, and what about internally for you? What does well-being for you look like at the moment?
Yeah. So I now sort of accept and recognize that being someone with a bit of a public profile, like people sometimes do recognize me in the street or, depending on the context, people will come up to me. And I have put a lot of myself out there either through the work or through doing things like, recording podcasts and doing interviews and media. So I know that there's a part of me that, in a way belongs to other people and I can't always control perceptions or how my work is received and interpreted.
Mm,
So I have, especially since becoming Poet Laureate, been a bit more, I guess, careful about, the boundaries and, what it is I put out on like social media. So, in the
mm,
past, I put all sorts of stuff out on social media. And now I feel like I just need to be a little bit more, not necessarily curated, but just have that sort of in the back of my mind whenever I post something like, actually, if I post a picture of my friends and my family, this is going out to a lot more people than it would
mm,
have in the past. So I just want to make sure that I'm doing right by them as well and just
mm,
also allowing myself to have space and time for myself as well, because I am giving so much of myself
Yeah.
through the Poet Laureate that your energy reserves are really messed up. While you're sort of trying to do all this public facing stuff, and then when I get home, I just need to shut down for a bit and sort of like look
mm,
after myself. And I've also got a day job as well, so I have to operate at a different level for that and be expected to turn up and be firing on all cylinders. So I have found, especially in the last 3 years, that I have needed those moments to myself and to really just cut myself off from the world and from social media, just so that I can actually get back to who I was in a way.
mm.
And to remind myself that, yeah, you do have to put yourself first a lot of times.
Yeah. I relate to that so hard, eh? Like in my job, I describe myself as I get paid to talk, right? This is a
Mm,
big, big part of my job. And I'm actually not an extrovert. So when I get home, I shut the door and I just do not talk to anyone. And that is for me, doing that and being in silence and going through my evening routine is really restorative for me.
mm.
What do you do when you get home from like a full on day? What do you do for your well-being?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people also assume that I'm an extrovert as well because out there, I read poems on stage, I address crowds, and I, do all these sort of events and things. But definitely do not consider myself an extrovert. I need to amp myself up and sort of get to
Mm.
that place where I can do those sorts of things. But when I'm back at home, I just want to cook. I just want to have a nice meal. I want to do those things where I can put, my favorite music on and just have that blaring in the background without it sort of distracting me. And yeah, go about, routine because I think that's something that I have not lost in the last 3 years, but has been really disrupted with all of the travel and all of the events and things like that. That like my typical day or my typical week isn't, the same. It's very
Yeah.
unpredictable, and I never know what else might be coming through in terms of requests and commissions and stuff. So then I have to figure out, well, how am I going to make all of this work in amongst everything else that I've been asked to do? So I just need to do things that I guess center me in routine, whether it's cooking, doing the chores. I love doing laundry. Laundry is like my favorite household chore.
I can relate to that so hard.
But
So
I
good,
love a
eh?
vacuum. I love a
yeah.
good like vacuum and laundry. Yeah.
And this, you see the end result, right? You have a nice pile of clothes that you've folded or ironed, and they're all stacked neatly. And that for me is like, there's this the sense of accomplishment for that, I guess, calms me because the writing, it's very different to the writing process when you have to sometimes go through so much to get to that finished product. And even then, you're not really sure about whether that finished poem is the end of it and, whether you still do more work on it. Whereas if you've washed a load of washing, folded it and put it away, it's like, that's done. Like nothing could happen to that
Yeah.
now.
I was the same, like, when I was finishing my PhD, I got really aggressively into puzzles because I
Yeah.
just needed something to be finished, and then I didn't have to look at it anymore. I could put it away and never think about it again. In terms of what else has sort of been supportive for you in terms of kind of your mental well-being, not just maybe in the space that you are now as Poet Laureate, but I know we've had some conversations about, times in life that have been a bit challenging. What kind of got you through maybe a difficult mental health challenge?
Yeah, definitely having a support network, having friends and family to talk to about, those really hard moments or things that are really weighing on your mind. I, was thinking about this in preparation for our chat. Like, Asians tend to be very stoic and
Mm.
don't talk about a lot of things because they don't want to dredge up the past or they don't want to have those difficult conversations. So, many of us are sort of raised in a way to not express that part of ourselves.
Mm.
And I was sort of relating this, I guess, to my development and journey as a creative that, because of that part of myself, I was always constantly expressing myself through, poetry and filmmaking and music and art. But you're adding a layer of, not artifice, but, you are putting that sort of shield between what it is you're really wanting to say and what actually comes out. Whereas if you're confronting, any particular mental health issues or worries or concerns and just speaking to them directly, that is quite a hard thing to do, especially if you're not raised in an environment where that is expected or that is the norm. Which isn't to say that, my family and I had never talked about things. It just, I don't think it was done in a way that was, no, I'm not going to follow that.
Yes, you're totally fine. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I know exactly what you
Yeah.
mean. It's
So,
like you don't want to, because it's not about begging our parents. That's not the reason why we have these conversations, right? But it's the acknowledgement of things weren't perfect, and
And they were doing the best with the limited resources that they got given, right? Like and they're also people who are learning and growing too. But in terms of maybe then in terms of I know that you come from quite a supportive family. For those who don't, I don't know which order it will come in, but Shannon is Chris's cousin. So tell me a little bit about what it was like having what I'm assuming is quite a supportive community in terms of your wider family, not just, your parents or your siblings.
yeah, so I do have a rather large extended family on both sides of my, mum and dad's side. And it has been interesting, I guess, in the last year because I was sort of reconnecting with a lot of them just through travel and things like that. And, in Wellington, we didn't have that many of my mum's siblings here for a while. So it was quite a small unit. But then over time, people started coming back to Wellington. So, I started having more of my cousins around and things like that. And it is, I've always loved reading about people's relationships with their cousins because sometimes they're more like siblings,
Yeah.
mm,
because they are similar ages or they have similar interests. And yeah, maybe you don't see them as much as your actual siblings, but enough to sort of form that rapport and that connection. So I've always been very, very grateful for, having, people like Shannon in my life because it does help build that familiarity and that connection so that you can talk about things that you might
mm.
not want to talk about with your parents or maybe not even with like my brother because I am so close to my brother and sometimes that closeness, works in different ways. It can be a really great thing because we can be open with each other, but also sometimes you think, oh no, I don't want to tell him about this because this
Yeah,
Yeah.
could
because it lives under the same roof. I can really relate to that, eh? But I mean, I'm not super close with my extended family, so I didn't have that experience with my cousins. But I think that's why I found making relationships with other Asian people who had grown up in New Zealand so easy because I felt that level of, I guess, just kind of the unspoken level of being understood and seen.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I can reason like I'm really close to my cousins who are here in New Zealand, and when it's like you don't see each other like you said that often, we're all I'm Filipino, so half my cousins are nurses, all work at the hospital.
Mate, you made the joke.
And so, they're really busy and we don't see each other that often. But when you do, it's like no time has passed. But you can also talk about, you'll be like, oh, yeah. But my favorite thing that we did, which is probably a little bit naughty, sorry, mum, if you're listening, but she probably won't, is we used
Ooh.
to cover for each other. They'll like call and be like, hey, have you seen Lovely? And they'll be like, yeah, no, she's And then they'd like text me and be like, bro, where are you?
I love that.
And we got each other's backs, which is really nice. In terms of, I guess, your journey as someone who is connected to family and connected to, I guess, a public space, and you sort of talked about having supportive friends and things like that. What did that support look like for you, and how did you go about figuring out who was supportive and who maybe wasn't as supportive?
So my best friend I have known since I was 5. We basically started school together, and so we have been through a lot. And he is someone that I can rely and trust with
And he's
certain
still your
things.
best friend?
My best friend.
Cool.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's the sort of friendship that is built on years and years and years. And actually seeing each other at different stages of our lives, and all the things that we've gone through individually and together. One of the, I guess, really great things that has happened for me in the last 4 or 5 years is actually falling into a community of Asian creators. Um,
Mm.
so when I started writing, there weren't that many Asian poets around, and I didn't sort of dwell on it for too long. But having made these sort of newer friendships, I sort of thought, I would have turned out a very different poet had that had happened to me right at the beginning of my creative practice and creative journey. So I always felt like I was filling, the token quota, being sort of just picked because
You were Asian.
I was the only Asian in the room. So yeah, that for me also created a lot of self doubt. I was like, well, am I being picked because I'm good or because I just want to?
Because I'm the only one, the only option. Yeah.
So and that's a really horrible place to be in as someone who's trying to find their voice as a creative, and not wanting to feel like you're just coasting because you are getting opportunities because of the color of your skin rather than
Yeah.
the quality of the work you produce.
Mm.
Yeah, in the last few years, being able to work on projects with only like Asian cast and crew, only Asian collaborators, has really changed how I think about the connection between my cultural identity and my creative practice.
Mm.
Um, and one of the first sort of major moments was when I was part of the sort of development of Nathan Joe's Zines from a Yellow Peril. So I was
Oh, cool.
Loved it.
yeah, amazing show, right? So I
Yes,
was asked
so good.
by Kane Young, who was the director, to be part of the cast. And I said, oh, well, no, I don't do acting anymore. Theatre's sort of behind me. I don't think I'm the right person. And she really pushed and said, no, no, no. I've seen you perform as a poet. And, I think who you are, you'll bring something to the cast, and you'll be able to bring your own experiences, because that was sort of part of what they were trying to do with this particular development and performance. So we did this sort of stage reading at the Civic in Auckland as part of the arts festival. So, we did wear costumes, and there was lighting and music, but we just stood on the stage and read for it. And that was the first time where I was part of something where it was a complete sort of group of Asian collaborators. And I can remember walking into that room on the first day of rehearsals and instantly feeling at home. Like I only knew a couple of the people in the room, but there was something about knowing that I was stepping into a space where I wouldn't have to explain myself, or there wouldn't be, there were understandings between us that were
Yeah.
unspoken.
Yeah.
And that really changed like my experience of being part of something like that. And
Mm.
yeah, since then I've been able to do a whole lot of other things where it is predominantly Asian creators or POC creators, and it is just such a
Mm.
different vibe. It's enriching, and it just opens you up to so much more, I guess, willingness to take risks in a way.
Yeah, okay.
100%. The word that comes to me, I mean, you talked about your experience going into that creative space. I can think about that in a different context. The first word that comes up for me is safety, in terms of
Mhm.
just like being able to put my mask down and just be.
Yeah, there's the feeling of knowing that, yeah, you might have disagreements over things, or you might, really have to hash something out. But there's something about knowing that you're both coming from a similar perspective, even if you're not like from the same cultural background. There's just
Totally.
this,
And even when you disagree, eh? You
yeah,
know the
yeah.
perspectives, yeah. That's cool. Man, Chris, you're such an interesting person to talk to, eh? Because I mean, working in mental health, living in mental health, I'm surrounded just by people who live and breathe mental health all the time, which is fantastic, but it means I don't get a whole lot of exposure to people who are in the creative space and in the creative world. So so I guess thinking about all of the amazing experiences that you've had so far, and I'm sure you've only sort of hit the tip of the iceberg with what you've talked to us about today. Is there any advice that you would give to your younger self, or anything that you would have done differently as a young person?
Oh, this is like that question on Drag Race where they ask them to interest a photo of themselves as a kid, which I always like. I must admit I do not like those but having said that, I think actually through writing and through all of my creative pursuits, I am talking to my younger self because a lot of what I do, not all the time, but I'm writing things that I wish I had access to as a younger person. So I talked about that reluctance to write about being Chinese and focusing on that particular aspect of who I am. But now that I'm older and now that I have a little bit more experience behind me and I can sort of look back on that time in my life, I now realize that I think I was too scared to unpick those parts of myself and actually have to form not necessarily an opinion about it, but sort of actually understand how that makes who I am as a person, what it actually contributes to me, to how I interact with people, to how I interact with my family and sort of acknowledge my ancestry.
Mm.
So for me, a lot of the writing that I do has been about creating that dialogue with my younger self and saying, hey, this is the stuff that you shouldn't be scared to confront because at some stage in your life you probably are going to have to and you should be equipped to do so. And I really love seeing the sort of younger generation of Asian creators having that freedom to write about the parts of themselves that are sort of reflected in their identity, but also write about anything they want. And I think for me, that's been always been the goal to be able to pick and choose and not have to have that expectation on you as a writer of HRIC.
Yeah,
Mm.
like if you want to write about diaspora, write about diaspora. If you want to write about literally nothing to do with being Asian, you shouldn't have to just because you are Asian.
Mm. So thanks so much, Chris, for coming on and sharing a bit about your story with us today. It's been super interesting to hear
Super
about.
insightful.
Yeah, very, very cool. So that's another episode of Between Two Worlds. And we will see you next time for
All
a new
right.
guest. See ya.
Cool.